Welcome to the debate. Today we are looking at the clock on the wall and asking a question that, well, it haunts almost every kitchen in the world. It is a question that sits right at this violent intersection of strict biology and messy human behavior. Does eating dinner after 8 p.m. make you fat?
It really sounds like such a simple question, right? A binary, yes or no. But as soon as you peel back that first layer, you find a massive, almost philosophical conflict in the scientific literature. Because on one side, you have the absolute ironclad laws of thermodynamics. Calories in, calories out. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred.
Correct. That is the physics perspective, the traditional view.
But on the other side, you have this rapidly evolving and frankly fascinating field of chrononutrition. And this field suggests that when you eat might be just as critical, perhaps even more critical in some metabolic contexts, as what you eat.
Yeah, and that is exactly the central conflict we are exploring today. We're asking, is the human body just a furnace that burns fuel efficiently regardless of the time of day? Or is it a rhythmic system, a biological machine where the metabolic fate of a single calorie actually changes depending on the position of the sun?
Exactly. Is the whole don't eat after 8 p.m. rule an actual biological necessity driven by our circadian rhythms? Or is it just, a behavioral heuristic? A useful rule of thumb that works simply because it stops us from mindless snacking on the couch while watching TV.
Right. And to answer this, we aren't just going to rely on common wisdom or fitness influencer talking points. We are looking at a range of source material today. We've got tightly controlled, randomized crossover trials, genetic studies on melatonin receptors, and some really large-scale epidemiological data.
And for the sake of clarity, we should establish where we stand in the ring today. I will be taking the position that total energy balance is the primary driver of weight. I believe the effects of timing are often way overstated by the media, and they're heavily confounded by what people are actually eating late at night. Plus, I think strict timing rules completely ignore the massive role of individual genetics.
And I will be arguing the counter. I take the position that human metabolism is fundamentally circadian. I believe the evidence shows that eating late causes physiological misalignment, essentially crossing wires in your metabolic dashboard, that actively promote fat storage and glucose intolerance, and this is independent of how many calories you actually consume.
It's a classic nature versus behavior setup. Let's just get right into it.
I want to start with the physiological reality here. My position is grounded in the fact that the body is not a static machine. We don't just have this singular metabolism that hums along at the exact same RPM 24 hours a day. We have a rhythm. We are governed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN.
Right, the master clock in the brain.
Exactly. The master clock in the hypothalamus. And it orchestrates what we call peripheral clocks in every single tissue of your body. Your liver, your pancreas, and crucially, your fat tissue. They all have their own watches, so to speak. And to prove this matters, I want to highlight a landmark randomized crossover trial by Vujovic and colleagues. This was published in 2022, and this study was rigorous.
Oh, I've reviewed it. It is a very tightly controlled study, I'll grant you that. They didn't leave much to chance regarding the participants' environment.
No, they controlled for everything. Calories, sleep, activity levels, all identical. And what they found was striking. When participants ate late compared to early, even with the exact same caloric intake, their wake time energy expenditure dropped. But even more importantly, their 24-hour core body temperature decreased.
Which implies what exactly? Like, why does a slight temperature change matter here?
Because that temperature drop is a very clear signal of a lowered metabolic rate. The body literally cools down. It burns less energy when you load calories into the biological night. It's as if the factory manager has turned down the thermostat for the evening to save power, but the delivery trucks just keep dropping off supplies. If the furnace isn't running as hot, you aren't burning through that fuel, you store it.
Okay, I see why you emphasize that study. And the data regarding the temperature drop is certainly high quality. But I come at it from a different angle. We really have to look at whether these physiological flickers, a slight drop in temperature, a minor change in expenditure, whether they translate to actual obesity outcomes in the real world. Because the real world is messy,
and biology often has redundant systems to handle these things.
It certainly does have redundancies, but the signal is undeniably there.
But does the signal create the outcome? For instance, there was a massive study out of King's College London. This involved over 1,600 children. They looked specifically at this after 8 p.m. variable. Now, children are growing, their metabolisms are high, and they are generally much more sensitive to nutritional inputs. If the clock was this universal metabolic switch that automatically forces fat storage, we should see that signal clearly in a population like that.
And what did they find?
They found absolutely no link between eating dinner after 8 p.m. and excess weight. None. This suggests to me that for the vast majority of people, the correlation we see between late eating and obesity isn't about the time, it's about the behavior. Late eaters tend to consume more alcohol, they choose nutrient-poor, energy-dense foods, they eat larger portions because maybe they skipped lunch.
Right, the classic pizza and beer effect.
Precisely. If you eat a grilled chicken salad at 9 p.m., is it really turning to fat just because it's dark outside? Or is the epidemiological data skewed because most people eating at 9 p.m. are eating heavily processed garbage? The King's College study suggests that if you remove the confounding variables of what they are eating, the when becomes much, much less significant.
I see your point about behavior. And obviously, I don't deny that late-night snacking usually involves potato chips rather than broccoli. However, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it completely ignores the molecular wiring of our adipose tissue. You can't just wave away the cellular mechanisms, because in that same Vujovic trial, they actually took biopsies of subcutaneous fat.
That is serious dedication from the participants. I certainly wouldn't volunteer for a fat biopsy just for a nutrition study.
It really is, yeah. But the findings completely justify it. They found that late eating altered gene expression in the fat tissue itself. Specifically, it downregulated pathways responsible for lipolysis.
Just for clarity, that's fat breakdown.
Correct. Lipolysis is the process of breaking down stored fat to use for energy. We're talking about specific genes like PLD6, DECR1, and ASH1. Late eating actually turned these genes down. It essentially dimmed the lights on the fat-burning machinery.
Okay, that is a very specific mechanistic finding. I'll acknowledge that.
It is, and simultaneously it upregulated adipogenesis, which is fat creation, pathways like GPAM. So purely at a molecular level, completely independent of whether you're eating a salad or a burger, the tissue is biologically primed to store rather than burn during the biological night. It's like the fat cells are locked in receiving mode. Plus, there is a serious hormonal headwind. Late eating increases the ghrelin to leptin ratio. So it physically increases the drive to eat, creating this biological cycle that fights against weight maintenance.
I hear you, but I just don't buy that these molecular shifts define the entire picture. We really have to look at the broader context. You mentioned genes, but let's talk about individual variability on a macro scale. We'll get to the MTNR1 gene later, which I think is the crucial puzzle piece here. But broadly, look at Mediterranean cultures. In Spain or Italy, dining at 9 p.m. or even 10 p.m. is totally standard.
Oh, sure. It is a fundamental way of life there.
Exactly. Yet, these populations often have significantly better heart health and longevity profiles than cultures like the US or the UK that might rigorously eat dinner at 6 p.m. If late eating was this universal metabolic poison, or if this fat storage switch was as powerful as you claim, the Mediterranean lifestyle wouldn't work the way it demonstrably does. The context, the food quality, the social connection, and the total daily energy overrides the timestamp on the meal.
That's a really interesting point, though. I would frame the Mediterranean paradox a bit differently. Those cultures often have entirely different daily activity patterns, perhaps a siesta, and often a much larger caloric distribution earlier in the day. Their lunches are huge. But let's dig deeper into the core debate here. I want to talk about metabolic efficiency and the thermic effect of food.
Sure, let's get into the numbers.
Because the body is simply metabolically inefficient at night. We have hard data showing that glucose tolerance is significantly higher at 8 a.m. than it is at 8 p.m. There is a study from Johns Hopkins that beautifully illustrates this. They compared a 6 p.m. dinner to a 10 p.m. dinner. Same food, same people.
And the result was?
The late dinner resulted in an 18% higher blood sugar spike, an 18% difference just from a 4-hour delay. and crucially, a 10% reduction in fat breakdown compared to the early dinner.
Look, those numbers sound dramatic. 18% higher glucose is nothing to sneeze at. But we have to ask the practical question. Does that acute spike lead to long-term adiposity if the total calories are strictly controlled? You mentioned the thermic effect of food, the TEF. This is the energy we burn just by digesting our food. It is indeed lower at night, meaning we burn slightly fewer calories digesting food while we sleep, but the magnitude of this effect is so small compared to total daily intake. We're talking about maybe burning 10 or 20 fewer calories. Does that explain an obesity epidemic?
But it accumulates. A 10% reduction in fat breakdown night after night after night is not trivial. It's compound interest. Over a year, that metabolic inefficiency adds up to real, measurable pounds.
Perhaps, but consider the night owl or the late chronotype. This is where I think the whole one-rule-fits-all logic completely fails. For someone whose biological clock is shifted late, genetically shifted, by the way, eating at 6 p.m. might actually be biologically too early relative to their personal melatonin onset. If we force a night owl to eat at 5 p.m., are we actually aligning them or are we misaligning them? The King's College study suggests the clock isn't a rigid universal law for everyone.
I agree that chronotype absolutely matters. But even in the Vujovovich trial, the reduction in energy expenditure and core body temperature happens regardless of the sleep and wake times. It suggests a fundamental misalignment between caloric intake and the circadian status of the organs themselves. Like I said, the liver and pancreas have their own clocks. They don't just wait for the brain to say go. When you dump a massive amount of energy into them while they are in their rest phase, you are forcing the machinery to work against its own programming.
But is the machinery working against its programming, or is it just adapting? You mentioned the molecular switch in fat tissue earlier, the downregulation of lipolysis. I'd argue that the human body is highly adaptable. If you consistently eat at night, does the body not upregulate certain transporters to handle that specific load over time?
The evidence actually suggests it doesn't adapt well at all. That's the core problem. The blunting of P38 MAPK signaling and TGF-beta signaling in adipose tissue. These are the very pathways that regulate energy expenditure. This suggests the system is rigid. It is programmed to store energy at night because we evolved in a world where night meant fasting. We didn't have refrigerators. Night was for sleeping, not digesting.
That is a very compelling evolutionary argument, and I generally agree that we are probably better suited for daytime eating. However, I have to introduce what I call the protein exception, because this is where the late eating makes you fat theory really hits a brick wall for me.
Go on. I think I know where you're going with this.
Look at the sports nutrition data, specifically the work by Grossen, Ress, and Van Loon. They have shown repeatedly that ingesting protein, specifically casein protein, prior to sleep does not turn into fat.
Right. This is the pre-sleep protein shake research.
Exactly. Instead of being stored as fat, that late-night protein actively stimulates muscle protein synthesis and improves whole-body protein balance overnight. The body actually uses it to repair tissue while you sleep.
I am very familiar with that research.
Well, if the body were truly in a storage-only or metabolic shutdown mode, as you claim, that protein shouldn't be utilized for synthesis. It should just sit there in the gut or be converted to fat. But it isn't. It suggests that the metabolic fate of a late-night meal depends heavily on the macronutrient composition. A protein shake is not a pizza. A piece of lean chicken is not a bowl of ice cream.
I see why you think that, and I will totally concede that single nutrient interventions, particularly pure protein, behave differently. If you isolate protein, yes, the body can use it for repair. However, I would frame it differently for the average person. Most people aren't drinking a pure casein shake at 10 p.m. They are eating dinner, a mixed meal, fats, carbs, and protein all combined. The primary concern with a mixed meal at night is insulin resistance.
Because of the melatonin interference?
Exactly. This brings us right to the mechanism of melatonin, which is totally crucial for understanding why that 18% glucose spike from the Hopkins study happens. Melatonin levels rise at night to induce sleep, but melatonin actually has a second job. It binds to receptors on the pancreas to specifically inhibit insulin secretion.
It essentially puts the brakes on insulin.
Yes, it's a built-in safety mechanism to prevent hypoglycemia while we sleep. The body thinks, I'm sleeping, I'm not eating, so I really don't need insulin.
If you eat a high-carb meal when melatonin is high, your pancreas physically cannot release enough insulin to clear the sugar. You get prolonged hyperglycemia. The sugar just sits in your blood, causing damage and eventually getting shoved into fat stores. It's not just about calories, it's about hormonal clearance.
I'm actually really glad you brought up the melatonin mechanism because it perfectly supports my argument for individual variability. This hormonal interaction isn't exactly the same for everyone. We have to talk about the MTR1B gene.
Ah, the diabetes risk gene.
Right? There is a specific variant, the G allele. A study published in Clinical Nutrition looked at this exact interaction you just described. They found that the impairment in glucose tolerance from late eating, that traffic jam of sugar, was statistically significant primarily in carriers of this risk allele.
But that allele is quite common. It's not some rare anomaly.
It is common, yes, but it's not universal. For the non-carriers, the people without this specific genetic risk, the timing mattered much, much less. The glucose response wasn't nearly as deranged. This strongly suggests that the 8 p.m. rule isn't a hard biological law for the entire human species. It's a necessary precaution for those with genetic susceptibility. It supports personalized nutrition over a blanket don't eat late mandate. If I don't have that gene variant, maybe I can eat late without paying the same metabolic penalty.
I'm still not convinced by that line of reasoning because even if the acute glucose spike is less severe in non-carriers, you still have the issue of lipid metabolism. You still have those gene expression changes in the fat tissue I mentioned earlier, the PLD6 and GPAM shifts, and you still have the massive issue of hunger signaling the very next day.
You mean the ghrelin response?
Yes. This is where biology actively drives behavior. Late eating lowers leptin, which is your fullness hormone, and raises ghrelin, your hunger hormone, over the subsequent 24-hour cycle. We saw this clearly in the Vujovic data.
So eating late literally makes you hungrier tomorrow?
Exactly. If you eat late tonight, you are physiologically primed to be hungrier tomorrow. It creates a behavioral loop that is driven entirely by biology. You aren't just fighting calories at that point, you're fighting your own appetite regulation. You wake up wanting more food, which leads to overeating during the day, which leads to another late, heavy dinner. It's a metabolic trap.
That is true, and I absolutely agree that late eating correlates heavily with overconsumption, but I view that as a behavioral loop, not necessarily a metabolic death sentence. If someone rigorously tracks their calories and controls their intake, the fat gain is not automatic. The increased hunger is a hurdle, yes, but it's not a metabolic blockade. A disciplined person can step over that hurdle.
But why create the hurdle in the first place? Why play the game on hard mode? If your own biology is fighting you, why not just align with it?
Because for a lot of people, eating late is literally the only option. We have shift workers, busy parents, students studying until midnight. If we tell them eating late makes you fat, period, we discourage them entirely. They might think, well, I missed the 8 p.m. window, I might as well just eat the junk food. The message really should be, eating late requires more attention to food quality and quantity.
I think we are actually nearing a synthesis here.
I think so too. The black and white answer just doesn't really exist in the data.
So, to summarize my perspective, the biological evidence, everything from the gene expression in fat cells to the hormonal rhythms of insulin and melatonin, strongly suggest the human body is simply not designed to process heavy caloric loads during the biological night. The SEN and your peripheral clocks clearly favor daytime intake. You are simply metabolically healthier when you eat while the sun is up.
And from my side, while the 8 p.m. rule is a very useful heuristic for preventing overeating, it is not a hard thermodynamic law. Genetics, specifically that MTNR1B gene, play a huge role in how we individually handle late sugar, and the type of food matters immensely. Protein before bed is metabolized very, very differently than a plate of sugar or fat.
We can certainly agree that chronic circadian misalignment, like what we see in shift work, is genuinely harmful. The data there is undeniable. Shift workers have significantly higher rates of obesity and diabetes.
Absolutely. That is chronic misalignment. But occasional late eating, if it's a high-quality meal, say grilled chicken and vegetables, and you aren't overconsuming your total calories, the evidence that this specific scenario will make you fat is much less clear-cut.
So for the listener, the real takeaway might be to know your own body. Are you a night owl?
Do you carry genetic risk factors? And importantly, are you eating late because you're genuinely hungry or just out of habit?
And if you absolutely must eat late, really look at your plate. Maybe skip the heavy carbs and go for the protein. Avoid that insulin spike when your melatonin is running high.
That is sound advice. Thank you for listening to the debate. We really hope this illuminated the complexity behind the clock on your kitchen wall.
Until next time, keep questioning the data.
Explore the material further and form your own conclusions. Goodbye.